It is really a privilege to be here with you. And I just want to, before we start, I want to make sure I've got the ground rules right. We're going to talk for till about 1, and then open it for questions and comments from the audience. So that's how we're going to proceed. There's lots to talk about in terms of the history of Piedmont Blues and about this place, Durham, and its role, and about this particular presentation that's going to happen here on Friday and Saturday nights. So I did, though, want to jump in. I thought a good place to start would actually be we don't have time for a whole history of Piedmont Blues, but to ask Glenn, who began doing field work in North Carolina, here and throughout the state in the 1970s, to talk a little bit about Piedmont Blues and its role within African American communities when he began his work in the 1970s, which now, Glenn, I can't believe it, it's 40 years ago?
Long time.
But would you reflect on that a bit?
You know, in the 1970s, there were still a lot of both active artists and folks that remembered a time when Durham was very different, a time when African American Durham was grounded in life around the tobacco factories, and when the creative side of Black Durham was a side that was known across the country. The city was a city that had not only produced a number of musicians who had gained national prominence in the ways that one gained national prominence in the 1930s and 40s, which was largely through the 78 RPM records, which were called race records and sold primarily to African American audiences. But it was a city that, because of its placement and because of the economics, fostered just a remarkably creative community of musicians, of talkers, of oral poets, of dancers. And it's really in looking at that whole, that sort of encompassing piece, that one begins to get a sense of the vibrancy that marked the city, and the vibrancy that in the 1970s was still echoing pretty loudly. At that time, a lot of those musicians, and certainly many people who had known the elder musicians, they were still around, the stories were still vital. Some of the music was still vital, though with changing times, of course, it was now seen more as a music of elders by that point. It was no longer the music that it had been, which was the primary music of the working class, a music of parties, a music of dance, a music of engagement, and a music of affirmation. That was replaced, more or less, as other musics played that role among the youth, because blues, of course, at that time was a music of the youth. It wasn't a music played by elders. It was a music played by people in their teens and their 20s and maybe into their 30s. So in the 70s, at the time, though, the ideas, the memories especially about the role of the music as a place of powerful affirmation about the humanity of blackness and about the humanity of the African American community, even in the midst of Jim Crow here in Durham, that was the piece that was probably most powerfully remembered at that point.
I want to, Glenn, play a piece by one of the Piedmont musicians who bluesmen that you were referencing, really one of the professionals, I guess, Blind Boy Fuller. But before I do, just to follow up, in the 1970s, was there a sense, or how much of a sense, I'm trying to get to the idea of the blues in North Carolina. You know, now we have a sense it's called Piedmont Blues. Is that a more recent description from outside as a way to define this music as opposed to blues across the South? Or, I mean, do you have a sense of, were you thinking about that at that time? Did it matter? Or does it matter now?
No, and no. You know, at the time, it was simply the music. It was simply, and the blues became a very generic term for all the secular musics of the day. It was certainly not called Durham blues, Carolina blues, Bull City blues, Piedmont blues, all terms which have come later and been imposed by outsiders. Folks in the community just called it blues.
Yeah.
And when they said blues, they didn't mean necessarily a 12-bar form. They didn't mean a piece that fit within narrow constraints. They meant all that music that was there for dancing.
Can we play a little bit of what's, I guess, become the anthem for North Carolina Piedmont Blues, at least?
You never listened to this music in the dark unless someone was in your arms.
But you know what's going on there? It's really a two-finger picking pattern. I think almost every older blues musician I met in the Piedmont picked with the thumb and one finger.
Yeah, folks would say if you needed a third finger, you weren't that good.
But all of that syncopated picking is being done on the guitar with the two fingers, and then to me, it's also really hard to separate the singing from the music itself.
The other piece there is what you were hearing in the background, the rhythm.
Yeah.
So this is sort of classic. That's a washboard, in the same way that like in the world of hip hop, folks repurposed the turntable and turned it into a rhythm instrument. That's precisely what was going on. You repurposed the washboard, the most common of utilitarian tools that you had around every house, and you turned it into a pretty complex rhythm instrument.
So, Gerald, I want to turn to you, and we've just heard that piece, and ask you, when did you first hear it, and now after living with this piece for a while, can you kind of give us your reactions as, coming from your particular background? I know, for example, blues is a foundational piece of jazz, but is there something unique, unusual, distinctive about this particular type of blues that strikes you, given your own particular experience?
Yeah, my journey started 2 years ago, actually, when I was approached to do this project. I was truly new to this at that point, and upon first hearing it, my ears and my mind sort of went to all of the music that I think has been influenced by that sound, that finger-picking technique. But it wasn't until this project that I really got a chance to dive deep into it. And since then, it certainly has been a journey. So, initially I think that what strikes me about this sound, this dialect of the blues, if you will, is the rhythmic component, that bounce, that feel. And another thing that sort of struck me as interesting, I'm always looking for sort of gem, sort of like something that strikes me, that stands out in the music. And there's examples of that in pretty much everything I've listened to. And in this one, in Step It Up and Go, it was the feeling that that we're sort of shifting the beat in an interesting place. Like it almost feels like they're missing a couple beats or something. So, I sort of made a mental note of that and then listened to more music, and I found a similar thing happening in a lot of other examples. But then when I went back to Step It Up and Go and reanalyze it, I found that it's what we call in musical terms a hemiola, that there's a shift, but the overall 12-bar form remains. And I found that really interesting, and that was one of the gems that I sort of latched onto in this song specifically. But I've found those things in a lot of different examples, and that's sort of given me a seed to work with when I've created this project, just to find something that sticks out in my ear and really explore that.
Can you talk a little bit about your goals for the project? When you said when you started to work on it, but what emerged as as what you wanted to accomplish?
Yeah, so I think that there's definitely a challenge in being asked to pay tribute to a language that's already existed, and especially one that I don't necessarily speak. It's not where I'm coming from. That can be kind of a daunting task. So the first thing you do is just become a student to the music and immerse yourself in the sound, and through Duke Performances, lucky enough, actually immerse ourselves in the land and the people and the culture, and that's been really helpful. And then the rest of the process is sort of what I mentioned before, and looking for those gems, looking for something in the music that resonates with my own musical sensibilities. So in that case, it was that hemiola. It was sort of the interesting placement of the chords. In another song, it was an Al Jammeh song that we're using in the piece called "Get Your Baby Out of Jail." And in this recording, I've never heard any old blues recording with that. I guess you could say it's a harmony. It's in our technical terms, there's like a sharp 11 sound there, and I never heard it used that way. And when I met up, we actually got to visit Al Jammeh, and I met with her guitarist Lightning. I said, Lightning, so that tune on "Get Your Baby Out of Jail, is that, so we got D, F sharp, and then G sharp, A, C, and he said, no, the banjo is just out of tune. So, and that was the gem. That was what I had. That's how the sound sort of existed in my head. So I'm still playing that G sharp. I don't care. But that's been the process. Is just finding these things and trying to find some relation to my own sensibilities in that.
Well, and before we move to Christopher, can you say a little bit about what we're going to, the folks who are helping you do this on Friday and Saturday nights, your band and the singers? And
yeah, it's a collection of musicians that I'm admiring. I admire all of their playing individually. Before I dived into the actual music and the actual language, I knew that this was going to be a piece in tribute of the blues, which means, it being in tribute of the philosophy behind the blues, sort of all of what that entails. That it's an expression that is a release of struggle, of pain, that's what's at the core of it. So the first thing I thought of was, let me find cats that I know can deeply get inside of that. So Logan Richardson was on the top of my list, this alto player from Kansas City, and every time I hear his sound, his playing, it feels like in deep, intense wailing. So I wanted him on board. Dana Stevens, a great tenor saxophone player who's also been playing baritone over the past few years. So he's our baritone player. Tavon Pennicott's a tenor saxophone player. Alan Hampton, a great guitarist, and also bass player and singer. But on this project, he's, when I mentioned that when I first heard Piedmont Blues, I thought of all the musicians who I think were influenced by that finger-picking sound. Alan is one of those guys. Joe Sanders on bass. absolute beast and has been my left-hand man for years. Kendrick Scott on drums, and Maurice Chestnut, a wonderful tap dancer to sort of represent the buck dancing element, and the fabulous Miss Renee Marie, who I've been a fan of for years, and turns out is actually a Piedmont native, so this project and this music really speaks to her. And we've also been working with Ray Watkins and the UBC Gospel Choir to be involved in this, and working with Christopher McElroen on the visual presentation of this. So that's what we got.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sounds very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So, Christopher, that's a great segue to you. Can you? I'm really fascinated by this. What you're bringing to the project, and what, if you could describe, maybe give us a little bit of a preview, since we don't have any visuals here. But what's your role? What are you trying to create?
Yeah, it's working with Gerald to execute his vision for the piece, both in terms of the narrative story that we're telling in the music, but also what is the visual envelope that holds that story. And the way we have approached it, as Gerald mentioned earlier, is to become students, not only of the music, but the landscape, the architecture, the people, the food, the story behind the music. And then how do we take that and distill it down into a form that we can execute visually? And so, we kind of latched on to, the Tobacco Barn architecture. So the first thing you see when you walk into the theater is this deconstructed tobacco barn that lends itself to that original architecture, but then combining it with kind of a contemporary art gesture. One of the things that we've talked about when we put this piece together is pulling the story forward. And so we're not doing a tribute concert to the blues, but trying to understand, what the core of the music is, and how does it pass from generation to generation. And so, we started with that tobacco warehouse, and we looked at the contemporary artwork of an artist named Damian Ortega, who deconstructs objects, and he has this beautiful piece where he has a Volkswagen Bug, and he deconstructs it beautifully, and it hangs in a gallery, and you can see how the pieces would come together and assemble. And so we latched onto that idea. We latched onto the idea of an assembly in terms of the music and how the music comes together. So you walk in and you see this deconstructed tobacco barn. You're introduced to 30 voices in the choir that are singing their own individual journey. And so this idea that we all carry the blues within us individually, but what happens when you collectively come together and it forms a community, and the strength that exists within that community, and how does it unfold from there. And so trying to surround the piece again within the landscape. And so we have a lot of video projections and spent a lot of time in the region with Al Jamae Hinton and Boo Hanks, who recently passed away, and John D. Holman, and went down to South Carolina, spent some time with Drink Smalls, and just put them in the landscape and put a camera on them and let them share their story musically. And we've captured that, and that kind of makes up the bed of the visual projections. But the idea has been to surround it and then pull the story forward. So.
Do you have, that begs the question, so as you've been on this journey, this may be a question for the end for all of us, but how does this music get transferred from generation to generation and made meaningful? That's part of the purpose of this concert, is to have us reflect on that. But do you want to say anything else about that?
You hear it in the compositions that Gerald has crafted. It starts with disparate voices that come together and find a harmony and community. And then he adds in spoken word, and so you have instrumentation and you have voice. And then he finds the marriage of that, and he gives you a song with lyrics. But that song the lyrics come from an interview that Elizabeth Cotten gave. And so he's deconstructed this interview to find the core of that message. And then he deconstructed Freight Train to find the seed in that, and then repurposed it. And so you hear the history of the music, but he's turned it into something wholly unique. And then it progresses to a point where we lean on Glenn's work from back in the 80s in his film Step It Up and Go, where you see a bottle player sitting by the river, and he just finds music in the air, and it's all around you. You just need to be open to it and accept it. And so Gerald takes that and he samples it and turns it into a beautiful piece, and then that transitions takes us into the more traditional Piedmont section, where you'll hear the traditional Piedmont songs. And once we've come to understand that music, he does this beautiful thing, and I'm going to steal some language from you from yesterday, where you talked about lifting the mask. Mm-hmm. And he takes a song, in the Jailhouse Now, which has a certain bounce to it, and he lifts the mask off of that song, and he's recomposed it and rewritten the lyrics to In the Warehouse Now. And so you understand, and it's kind of this dirge, and you understand the relationship between a rich land and a poor people, and the conflict that exists within that, and what prevents things from coming together the way they want to, the way they should. And so once we understand the music, he does this beautiful thing where he just lifts the mask and we see behind the music. And then he takes us back to the beginning again, where he starts to deconstruct it in this idea that if God is music, there is a salvation in the blues. But the harmony changes. And it's as if you've dropped a coin into one of those cyclone things, and it passes around and it comes back on itself, but it's a layer deeper, and it's moved on. And you hear the progression, but it's so subtle. And so what he's crafted it really is breathtaking what you've done. And so to be able to help support that, in the room with the artists that have been assembled. So he pulls the story forward in a very subtle way and in a very intellectual way of understanding the music and deconstructing it, putting it back together, and then pushing it into the hands of these amazing musicians. So,
cheers.
And I was speaking with Eric about this yesterday or the day before. I sometimes being in the arts, you take for granted the power of coming together, theater in particular, or performances. The idea of people actually being physically in a room together these days to experience something that we're about to see was much more commonplace. Even when Glenn started his field work, the act of people physically coming together to experience something rather than experiencing it through. Now, it's what happens so often now, through
well,
the web.
we've taken that structure kind of directly from Glenn's film, because that's what you see in what he's crafted is the individual story, and then at some point the individual can't hold, and it has to come together, and there has to be this collective release. Yeah. And so we've kind of followed that that footprint.
Well, I didn't actually. I probably should have tried to identify something from Step It Up and Go, the film that Glenn worked on in the 1980s, but instead we have something from Al Jamay's one of her house parties, which I wanted Glenn to kind of set up. Is it possible to show that? Yes. Can people see that? Okay. So, but this is Glenn. Can you haven't seen this, but can you talk a little? This was when Alan Lomax came to North Carolina and asked you to help facilitate this. So, could you talk a little bit about it and what were? I don't know if you remember how much you remember from this experience.
More than I want to, in fact. One of the points here, and I think the point in showing this clip, is to suggest that when we think of this music, especially when cultural outsiders, when white folks most particularly think about this music, we have an image that's been crafted for us, an image which is crafted by generations of racial portrayal, which are all about removal and isolation and a kind of, it's almost a kind of evisceration, because the music is presented as something that happens on stage with an isolated elder, usually, sitting in front of an audience who is not interacting, but is just there as audience. And there is a performance in a very Western European and white American performance mode. This music was never, ever that. This music was always a music of engagement, of co-performance. It was a music where there were no stages. There were no front porches on which individuals sat. That is the classic image that we still have. If there was a front porch, it was a front porch surrounded, and a front porch which only served as a stage for a party. And that party, the only reason that you would use the front porch at all is because when there is buck dancing going on, the stage serves as a place of resonance. So when your feet are striking against the wood of the porch, and the fact that there's an underneath openness to that porch, then you have an echoing, so it's almost as if you're dancing on a drum. You can't get that sound if you're out in the yard around it. So in this clip, what happened was that Ms. Aljamain Hinton had invited a bunch of friends over. And this was done for the filming, but what happened is around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, things were loose, things were happening, where you got a sense, you got to see the porch being used that way. You had a yard full of people that you don't see in the video, because the video was shot to focus on the porch, as we have come to unfortunately expect. But what you had was this whole community of people who were moving on and off the porch. There are musicians playing in different places. There's a lot of elegant talk. There's a lot of sweet talking going on. There's a lot of informal courting going on. There's dancing happening everywhere. There's beautiful movement happening everywhere. There's a lot of flash, a lot of display, a lot of folks showing themselves off in what they do best. And what this is a tiny moment excerpted from that whole, where you see, I believe in this cut, where you see Junior Thomas, who is a poet, bottle blower, a remarkable dancer, here as a dancer with, I believe, Aljamain Hinton. Ms. Aljamain Hinton playing the guitar. Aljamain Hinton herself, just so we will remember the portrayals of most of this music, is often gendered. We often see the maleness of it. In this area, historically, women were as often the masters of this music. They just didn't get recorded. Ms. Hinton learned from her mother, who was a master musician. Her aunts all played music. This was a women's family where it was the women who were the carriers of the mastery. And in this case, we still get to see Ms. Hinton performing some of that mastery. So imagine Mr. Thomas 40 years before this was taken.
Glenn, was that footage or some of that footage used in Lumex's Patchwork
Yes, yeah.
series?
On YouTube, fortunately, what they've done is they've reissued most of the film taken during that long evening. A few very small fragments were edited out and in the PBS American Patchwork series for the one on. I think actually it's the show about the Appalachians, which somehow we have Deep Piedmont found its way in the middle of that, but that's where it shows up.
I know y'all have addressed this. Maybe we should have shown this earlier, but I mean, it is a challenge, is it not, to try to take what we saw up there and then put it on a stage at Duke University. Can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe, and Glenn, you can chip in here too about how, I mean, how would you advise somebody if you've been asked to come in, to take this kind of community spirit and place it in this setting? So.
Yeah, I think step one is doing exactly what we just did and just observing and watching and soaking it in. So I spent a lot of time with these clips and writing down some of the rhythms that Aljamae and Mr. Thomas were beating out with their feet. And again, kind of looking for something that strikes me as interesting in there and using that as the basis of the composition. So in another video, Aljamae, she's buck dancing, and she does a rhythm that turns out to be a 5-bar phrase, which I found really interesting, and it feels really natural. It's just dum 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 ksh ksh dum 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 dum. So I'm using that as a platform when we feature our buck dancer, our tap dancer, as a vamp to sort of pay homage to that. And then, like you said, the spirit is something that we just have to keep in our hearts and our minds. And I think every time I step on stage to play, my goal is to express myself with as much clarity and honesty as possible. So in this context, thinking about what it is that we're trying to convey and taking this spirit, the emotions and the feeling of the videos that we're watching, and really trying to truthfully convey that, I think is just something that's a task. It's just something you have to go for and try.
Christopher, you have a thing to add? You were eloquent earlier about your efforts, but.
Yeah, just echoing what Gerald said. I think he made a decision fairly early in the process to bring Maurice Chestnut onto the collaborative team, and he's our dancer. And I think that choice was based in the research, and again, based in wanting to capture the essence of not just the music, but the region and the experience. And so we find little slices of it in the production, where you just get that little taste of what it might have been to be present, at that. And within the video projections, we do pull on a lot of this archival material and juxtapose it with, that video which was shot in 1983, and the video that we shot with Al Jameh a couple of months back, where we went into her juke joint, and her spirit hasn't changed.
Right.
It's not possible for her to sit still when the music starts playing, and so she's in a wheelchair, but yet she's still dancing, and it's a beautiful thing to behold. And so we've just tried to capture that essence and just slices of it.
It's a question for all three. Oh, did you want to comment?
I'm wondering, Christopher, could you tell the story you told yesterday about Mr. Holman walking through the field of grass? In terms of, I thought that so tellingly captured this vision when you talk about essences, how it's beyond just the essences of the music or the dancing, but it's this bigger artistic, creative whole. And I thought that so captured it in an unexpected way.
Yeah, I think we were talking about grace yesterday,
Yes.
and trying to capture the grace that exists within the region, within the music. And so we spent a beautiful day with John D. Holman, and he's 83, 84 years old, and we put him out in a field in the sun for an entire afternoon, and he would pick up his cane and he would start to walk through this tall grass towards this structure that has been there for 100 years. And the way he just moved through the landscape towards that structure and the history that existed within that architecture, and just trying to understand the weight and the movement of seeing this 85-year-old man walk through this tall grass towards this structure that has a history to it, of the American South, and just allowing that image to speak for itself and to find the grace in that, and knowing that in that journey that he's making on that day, it somehow encompasses everything he's ever put through that guitar. And so we've tried to kind of capture that grace and that beauty, and just the simple thing of watching somebody walk through the landscape. And Gerald has done the same thing with the music. And so what we're doing now in process is wrestling with the balance of that down the block at the theater, where we're putting all the pieces together.
So it's obvious that you two have really come to hold this place dear, North Carolina and Durham, and do you think, though, and this is for all of you, I mean, do you think that that this music, or I'll focus on music, I won't try to widen it to culturally to anything bigger than that, but is music still a place-based piece of culture or part of culture, or in these days? And what does what could, or maybe the other way to ask the question is, do you have any hopes that what you're going to do here on this weekend will somehow stimulate or inspire people in this place to do something that follows up on this legacy?
Yeah, I've been falling in love with Durham every time I come, more and more, and it's fortunately this is maybe my 8th or 9th trip. I'm starting to lose count, which is a good thing. But I've also, it's been my experience that the music scene, the young musicians in this town, the scene is thriving. It's like every time I come, I find out about a new jam session, you know, somewhere where cats are getting together, and you know, there'll be a DJ on the break and people are dancing, and a band playing, some church musicians getting together and playing some hip hop or soul music or whatever it is. So, and Christopher and I were talking about yesterday, the question is often posed to us, where is, you know, in my case, it's often asked, what about the future of jazz? You know, do you worry about it going and it dying, that kind of thing? And the labels we put on the music are one thing, but that creative gene it lives on. I don't think that ever goes away. I think the need to express ourselves, express the joys, the sorrows in life, it's something that crosses all boundaries. It's just the most human thing. So, in my experience in making music and dedicating my life to the artistic process, it's a feeling of moving forward and searching for new expressions, new sounds, new ways of finding tension and release in the expression, but also at the same time reaching back and exploring our roots further. So it definitely is my hope that the young musicians or just people who come to see this are encouraged to dig deeper into history and approach it with a questioning mind and say, well, are the stories that we've been told, is that the whole picture, or is there more there? And how can we relate it to my experience now and where we're going? And I think we find that it becomes one sort of spectrum of the same thing from then until now. So it's my experience.
You know, I think this is not about archaeology. I think that so often when people look at this music or the blues generically, that it's almost an archaeological journey. It's a preservationist's task. So you find out all you can about these narratives, and you set it in a time that you have partially constructed, in a place that you have partially constructed, and you leave it there. And there's a celebration of that there-ness, which is a construction. I think the music originally was always about a denial of all those boundaries. It wasn't about delimited locations. It wasn't about definitional boundaries. It was about, as Gerald was saying, it's about creativity. It's about how do you create within community in ways that speaks to the concerns and celebrations and epiphanies of those communities. And I think that in the way that the blues did then, the blues was coming from a long trajectory of musics and dances and talk and poetics doing that. And that trajectory has just gone on. And it's very much with us still here now, I think.
Open up the conversation here. Do you have questions? Yes, sir.
It appears that a lot of African-American music historians like to show an evolution, particularly of the Delta blues moving up into modern electric Chicago blues, and also New Orleans jazz evolving. It seemed to me that Piedmont blues landed on the earth fully formed, but never really evolved into other more modern forms of it. Is that a correct assessment, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't. I mean, I don't. If I can interject my experience, which is actually not right here in Durham, but working a lot with a woman, Etta Baker, who, and Glenn, of course, also knew Etta and worked with her. And she lived in Morganton, and getting to know an astounding two-finger guitarist. But if you look at her music, I mean, what you start to see, and this is my opinion, and these folks may disagree, but what I find is that you start to look at her father's music. It's very connected to banjo music of that region. Actually, if you follow this route back, white and African Americans start to come together a lot more than what we think of today. Blues are sort of thought of as African American, country music is white, and it just doesn't stand up. I hate to say it, but I'm glad to say it, because I think there's so many myths out there about music. And I've done a lot of work in Western North Carolina with Appalachian music. When I first got introduced to that music, and that's kind of wild, because I was out on Duke Quad here, and there was a fiddler from, this was 1974. Mm-hmm. There was a fiddler from Western North Carolina there, and he played this piece called Scotland, and he said, that comes from the British Isles. Mm-hmm. No. And when we started to get into it, and see how much of Appalachian repertory had been shaped by African American mixed race, actually even Cherokee tradition, it was remarkable. So the first part of your question is, I think it's not fully, I think the formation of it is more complicated. And if you listen to banjo syncopated styles, which predate guitar, I think I'm right here, you'll find that there's a lot of similarity there. Now, looking at John D., and you guys, John D. Holman, who was in the film sitting to the right of Al Jameh, he's taken pieces, he's wonderful two-finger player, but he also has taken a lot of music from outside the Piedmont Blues repertory and incorporated it into his repertory. But that's my opinion, so y'all...
I want to tell one story.
Yeah, okay.
This isn't about music. This is about dance, okay? And it's a story that I just heard just recently from Junius Brickhouse, who's the founder of Washington, D.C.'s Urban Artistry. It's an urban dance collective. And he was talking about, he was down in Savannah, Georgia, a number of years ago when he was in the military, and he went into a local 7-Eleven. And there, at the end of the 7-Eleven, near the counter, was James Brown. Now, this guy is a dancer, and he looks up and he says, I will forever rue the day if I don't go talk to James Brown, so I have to come up with a question. And so his question was, so before there was funk, what were you dancing? So he walks up to Mr. Brown, introduces himself, apologizes, says he's in the military, but he has one question. Mr. Brown looks at him and says, back in my day, when I was young, the dancing that we used to do, we called it buck dancing. That's right. And I thought, okay, right there. And now, what House is doing is in training young urban dancers in the DC area, he's saying, y'all got to pay attention, because actually there are James Brown moves that are so much a part of hip hop now, but they were actually a part of buck dancing in the Southeast then. And it's that kind of connection, and I would argue that you could chart that same connection in a lot of musical places, far beyond what we're hearing this weekend, where it sort of blossoms and then blows up into something very different.
The pleasure of being a Durham resident for 42 years came probably as textiles and tobacco were on their way out. Had the good fortune in 82 or 83 to see Elizabeth Cotton in concert before we freight train as a near 90-year-old. When I think of the theme that each of you have spoken to about transferring the music from one generation to another, I would just commend, maybe not to you, you're probably certainly aware of this, as many here, but the Music Makers Relief Foundation, located in Hillsborough, has touched the lives of over several hundred of these artists over 2.5 decades. It's probably pretty clear that few, if any, are drawing royalties as one of Billboard's top 100. And these artists, many of them are still playing. Among those that they've served and assisted include Albie May Hinton, Lightning Wells, Etta Baker. Performances still take place in the area by those who are able to perform. Musicmaker.org is their URL, and I'm just curious what any of you think about this kind of initiative in this area as to whether it exists elsewhere in pockets of the country to sustain the artists that we are not doing an archaeological retrospective on.
Yeah, thanks to Music Maker, actually, that was a big help in us actually getting to meet these elders and actually getting to hang with them. And, you know, with any ambitious organization based in sort of an artistic quest, I find that there's people, sort of personalities in all of these institutions that are really just passionate about music, about art, that it's not a, you know, let's see if we can make money off of something and exploit it. It's really sort of a passion for that art, and Tim Duffy at Music Makers is certainly that person. I think you find that all over the world. I mean, if I'm playing at a club or a you know, venue somewhere, chances are there's somebody who's, you know, not making money and paying dues, and it's, you know, sort of struggling to keep that alive. And I think it takes that, and but I do think you find that all over. I would love for there to be some way for everybody to come together and sort of keep each other afloat, because I do think it's really important work. But that, from my experience, you know, there are those types of people everywhere, and that's probably a testament to the art, to the music, and how it affects us. But of course, we need you know, 10 times as many Tim Duffys in the world.
It's obvious that you all who are making these performances were involved with the African American performers and in that community. And maybe this is a question more for Eric and Aaron. I wonder, was there an attempt to publicize these, or to, among the local African American, these performances?
You want to take that, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so someone on Facebook says, I hope it's not the normal university crowd at the performances. To which I responded that we make all sorts of efforts to engage different communities in Durham in the performances we offer. And sometimes, I mean, so the question is, how do you talk to an African American community in Durham? Is there a monolithic African American? The answer, and then the next question, is there a monolithic African American community in Durham? The answer is no. And you know, so we've worked with Tim Duffy and a cadre of musicians who surround him. We're working with Ray Watkins and First Union Baptist Choir. I mean, I think it's an interesting question to it's sort of like, well, we would like to see a more black audience. How do you do that?
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So it's a long running question. Some of it has to do with the architecture of the space, right? You were presenting a performance in Reynolds Theater. The benefit of Reynolds Theater is it's a fully equipped, great theater. One challenge with that space is that, you know, the Duke campus, while it's probably better than it has been in the past, nominally is a difficult space to access if you're not familiar with accessing it. So we work on these things a lot, and we continue to work on them. We're always gratified when we see a diverse audience, but I think we're also mindful that a diverse, that there are all kinds of different audiences within the African American community, just like there are different portions of audience amongst the white community in Durham. So I think it's an interesting challenge. I mean,
I'd add to that too, that when we started this project, the conversation began about, can we put this in the landscape, in the Durham landscape, and do a site-specific version of this, which is what we wanted to do from the beginning. And that's to Duke Performance's credit, to have that vision and to support us in that vision. And then, ultimately, we realized that we would be sacrificing an aspect of the music by putting it in an environment where you couldn't receive the music in its totality. So when we first started talking about this, we had talked about various spaces, site-specific spaces throughout Durham that we would pull on the history of the tobacco industry, the tobacco warehouse, a tobacco field. But ultimately, it just became logistically too challenging for us. So I think as an artist who has collaborated with Duke Performances over the past decade, the conversation always starts with Aaron. Is that community engagement aspect, and there's always institutional challenges in reaching audiences, but they're very conscious of it, and the conversation always starts there with them.
I want to note just one other thing that's sort of come up in this conversation. I feel like it's worth addressing. It's like so the generation of Piedmont Blues musicians that are living now are the second generation, right? And they are in the course of this project. Boo Hanks, who was a musician Gerald met, passed, right? Aljamain Hinton is elderly. John D. Holman is elderly. It is not at all clear. It has not been made clear to me at all that there is another generation of musicians, of Piedmont Blues musicians, that are coming up after that. I mean, I think arguments can be made about one person here, one person there. So I had always hoped, so I've lived in Durham for 10 years. I programmed Duke Performances for 10 years. I always wanted to make a project around the Piedmont Blues. And it was only when I heard Gerald play that I think, oh, that's a way that we can approach this topic. Because it felt to me like there's been very little innovation in the blues in probably a half century. Again, we could argue about it, but and it felt like what I wanted was something that was a kind of synthetic project, something that was like that allowed the creator a lot of license to say what he or she was intending to say, not a straight on tribute. And we did think very seriously about involving some of those older musicians in the project, and we just felt like they did not have the and we presented those musicians in the past before. They didn't have the kind of wherewithal at this moment in their lives to hit at 8 o'clock, full on and be ready to go through a whole performance. So that's why we took this approach. The other thing that I'll mention that we're quite proud of is that the project will play at Strathmore in DC or North Bethesda next week. And then in April, it'll play at the Savannah Music Festival and the Maudlin Center in Richmond. And our hope is that it will play on the West Coast, that it will have some touring life to it as well. So,
and this is one of two community conversations.
This is one of two community conversations.
And the other one
was yesterday.
Or was, where?
At BU Cafe.
Which is a very central gathering point.
So the other point I would make, and then I'll stop talking because it's not my panel, is that Duke Performances has been invested for the last decade in helping jazz musicians make evening-length projects, because we feel like that's actually also a place where there's a lack of support. There are more numerous places where a jazz musician can play 2 sets or even be featured on a program, but to ask a jazz musician to say, I want you to work with media, I want you to tell a story, I want you to compose an evening I want you to compose a program that runs over the course of an evening, is just not that common anywhere, frankly. So in a sense, we've also tried to bolster that American tradition.
Hi. Sorry for the simplicity of my question, especially compared to some of the other ones. You mentioned that one of the goals of your project is to inspire people, and you've already inspired me. I'm from Mexico, and I just recently moved to the area, and I'm very excited to go out and start exploring this music. So having this panel of experts, I'd love to ask you, where do I start? Can you name maybe 5 records or artists that you would think would be great places to start?
Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth Cotten was #1 for me. That was that sort of propelled me into this. But everybody we mentioned, John D. Holman, Aljamain Hinton, Etta Baker. It was actually a video with you and Miss Baker that led me to actually get a guitar and try to work out some of the finger picking stuff so that I wasn't writing nonsense for the guitar player on the gig. Let me actually figure out what's going on here. That was really helpful. But
Music Maker is opening a venue next week near to the ballpark called the Bullpen, and they'll be programming that venue. So they have the soft opening on Thursday, and I don't think it will all be all Music Maker artists, but it will all be programmed by the Music Maker organization. So it'll be a good opportunity to hear those folks.
yeah,
John D. plays monthly at the Blue Note.
Yeah.
I mean, he's still a working musician.
He's playing tonight, right? From what I hear, yeah. I think he's got a gig tonight. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, even just going to Music Maker and just exploring. I mean, it's these days all you need is one name and type it into the Google box and the rest takes care of itself. You just explore from there. Yeah.
So I'm going to add a name to that list,
Please.
since we haven't named it yet.
Yeah.
Is check out the music of Gary Davis. Later, the Reverend Gary Davis, who was in Durham from about 1920 until 1941, and a major influence on the music here. But then he moved up to New York City, became a part of the folk revival, influenced everyone from Jorma Kaukonen to whoever. He taught for many years, but his style he was the one in many ways from whom Blind Boy Fuller learned his tricks. So
I like that you call them tricks.
I think we're time for us to end.
One person who had our hand up.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
You know what?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't see
I'll
that.
come talk to you individually.
Yeah.
I got a lot to say. I was born in Durham. I'm a tap dancer. I got a lot.
Okay.
So I'll
All right.
let everybody else go about their day.
Well, in closing, I want to say that we're looking forward to this weekend. Gerald and Christopher and Glenn, appreciate all that you've done to inform this project, and congratulations here to Aaron and Eric for presenting, organizing something like this. So, and thank you all for coming. It's been an interesting conversation.
yes, indeed.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.